last decade, they increased their wealth substantially, a 10% increase actually in the last year of the last decade. At the same time, poverty has been growing in the United States, and we've seen in this deal, tax increases for the rich have been rolled out because the Republicans can't countenance that. There are going to be major cuts in Social Security benefits and in Medicare, the medical benefits for that, which will affect regular people massively. They are going to carry the burden of these cuts. And I think you've got to question why this is happening. There wasn't actually a problem with American bonds before last week. They were growing. There wasn't a collapse in the American bond market. American state finances were relatively good. I think that Obama has used this to drive through an agenda which has been in Wall Street's eyes for a long time, and this is happening elsewhere. It's been happening in Europe, which is to, Naomi Klein wrote about this in a book called The Shock Doctrine. They'd use a crisis, construct a crisis, and then use this to push through further measures. Privatisation, taxing, more further in taxing on poor people and the majority of the population, actually cuts in spending. And the one thing that is not going to be cut is military spending. There's been talk about it, but they're not going to cut it because the money has been spent and is guaranteed above inflation. Military spending in the United States has increased for the last 13 years, a 70% increase over those 13 years.
Let me go back to Robert. As I say, Professor Shakespeare painted a very grim picture and said there's going to become more of a military influence within America. Do you recognise that?
Not really, no. These types of statements have been made for many years. I think they're alarmist, exaggerated, and they simply haven't come true.
So what was the crisis this time? Because there was a crisis. The whole world was focused on Capitol Hill just a few days ago, waiting to see if a deal could be brokered. What was the big crisis?
Well, it certainly wasn't whether America would suddenly become a fascist dictatorship. It had to do with the reputation of the United States fiscally and therefore politically in the world markets and in the relationships of trade, currency, allied relations, weapons acquisition, which has been correctly pointed out as a continuing pastime. But it was not as if the very gloom and doom scenario painted a few moments ago was about to come true at all. I don't recognize it a bit.
Well, America's reputation as the world's biggest spender is to blame for its crisis, according to some. So Mohamed Walji headed to a street famous for its shops and shoppers and asked consumers there what they thought.
I'm here on Oxford Street in central London, where shoppers raise their debts to ask members of the public what they think about the US debt crisis. So let's hear what they had to say. America's on the verge of bankruptcy. What do you think will be the effect if it's allowed to default on its loans?
Well, I wouldn't say it's on the verge of bankruptcy in the sense that America generates real wealth all the time. It's not like Greece. It's going to effectively cause trouble around the whole financial system. People will then question the reserve status of America. It's absolutely essential that there is no default. If there is a default, it would be calamitous. The world would stop moving. It would be that serious.
If you defaulted on a loan and asked the bank for more money or expand your overdraft, what do you think the response would be to that?
I don't think they'll entertain me anymore. And I'll be going more into debt, nothing else.
How they deal with the public, you know, or a company is completely different than how you deal with a country. Banks are prepared to lend to you if you can prove that you don't need it, is that old phrase.
How many times do you think the US debt ceiling's been raised in the last 50 years, if you had to hazard a guess?
I would say 10 times.
If I told you 74, would that surprise you?
Yes. You would say it's a very large number, but I don't know offhand.
Still, 74 is a big number.
Bambery, one person there said if America defaulted, the world would stop moving. I mean, that's quite a dramatic thing to say. How true is that?
I think also someone said America produces wealth, and it's true. Wealth will continue to produce the United States.
So what's all the panic about?
Well, in one sense, I think there is a panic about these rating agencies, Moody's, etc., and the ratings for America. I think you've got to ask questions about these ratings agencies. They've been going around the world creating havoc. They were responsible in part for the economic mess 2-3 years ago with the collapse of Barings. They got that completely wrong. And I think someone should question that suddenly there's this huge fear that America is going to lose its AAA package, etc. You know, this is built up, and it's hysteria.
Well, the Chinese rating agency has dropped it from
The
A+.
Chinese are interested, but the Chinese are caught here. They hold America's debts. So that was the point. The Bush administration, previously, was quite happy to run a trade deficit with China, knowing that the Chinese held American debt, and while they held such massive debts, they couldn't allow America to default. Therefore, the Chinese are caught in this. What's more interesting, and I think this is escaping people's attention, is that the problems are beginning to develop in China. China is not immune from the rest of the world system, and economic growth, which we're seeing in some parts of the world, in Brazil, Germany, and India, is very dependent on the Chinese economy continuing to grow. If the Chinese economy gets into trouble, then we're talking about something very serious. I don't see the evidence for it in America. There is a problem. I think it's an underlying problem with America, the American economy, as represented by the bankruptcy of General Motors and a whole series of other things. I think it's worth saying two figures bearing in mind. He spent $13 trillion bailing out the banks and our financial institutions. That's way above this budget deficit. And the current cost of its wars, which is conducting the war, is between $3 and $5 trillion. Again, way above that. By simply cutting the aid, the money they've invested, essentially nationalised the bankers' debts, or by cutting back on defence spending and military spending, they could solve that debt crisis immediately.
But according to you, Professor Shakespeare, they're not going to cut any military spending at all.
No, and they're not going to address the serious problems internally. You're looking at 20 to 22% unemployment, and amongst those in the young people, or particularly in blacks and Hispanics, you're probably looking at 40% unemployment. You've got 44 million on food stamps. They don't seem to have any mechanism for when people lose their homes. Now, at the moment, America has been relatively quiescent, and that's probably because unionism was smashed from Ronald Reagan onwards. But the time is coming when the Americans will wake up to the fact that their system has failed them, that they're not all going to become billionaires, that they're not even going to have an ordinary job. Real wages have been going backwards for 25 to 30 years. Now, you can't get away from any of that. And a lot of Americans have guns, so you're looking probably within a year or so of great disturbances building up and a very violent, nasty repression. And abroad, face the facts. You're on 6 Islamic wars and they're trying to go for 2 more. You've got an aggressive militarism.
Before. Which two,
I did say it before, and it's the
countries?
great truth. Well, the 2 extra ones they want to go for are Syria, and because American foreign policy is controlled by Zionism, the Israeli wants to actually entrap the Americans into an attack on Iran. It would be a great mistake, but the situation could lead to that because of the overall collapse in the economic
Well, let
situation.
me move over to Robert, because you're shaking your head.
Certainly, I'm shaking my head, yes.
If you can address the issues that, you know, everyone knows that the Americans jealously protect this right to bear arms. There are a lot of Americans who are tooled up and they're getting very angry with their economic situation. Can you see a danger there?
No. I think that's, again, entirely exaggerated, bordering on hysterical, to say that because the Constitution allows Americans, broadly speaking, the right to bear arms, not without conditions, of course, but because this is there, and because many Americans do have guns, and they really do. When people go there for the first time, visit Texas, for example, and see you can't find a pickup truck without a rifle strapped to the back of the cab. But they don't go out in the street and settle their arguments with those guns. So to conclude that because Americans have guns, that their social and economic dissatisfaction would lead them to use those guns in some sort of a violent revolution or revolt, I think is really ridiculous.
What about the backlash from ordinary people, though? Again, we were told that if America defaults, 50 million welfare checks wouldn't be signed.
Well, this would have been a real crisis.
That would be 50 million very angry
citizens. That's right, and I'm one of them because I have an American Social Security pension. But this was never really going to happen, as someone said, other than in the imaginations of Washington politicians. The people who absolutely depend upon their government check, the military, the retired, people involved in medical care and so forth, they were never going to be cut off and left out to dry. That was simply an exaggeration, but it would have caused a gigantic crisis, and the president was very well aware of this. I'm no great fan of Obama, but he didn't handle this altogether badly at all.
Right. Chris, I mean, Robert, one of the 50 million who may or may not have got his welfare check, seems very laid back about this situation.
I think for a lot of people who voted for Obama, hoping for a change, this will be seen as a huge reverse. You know, healthcare was one of the promises. The attacks on Medicare are central to this crisis package. Unemployment benefits are going to be savaged. The people who voted for Obama, I think, will see this as a reverse and a victory for the Tea Party, the Republicans and so forth. Actually, I think it's less that. I think it is Obama following through a Wall Street agenda, but I think there'll be a sense that the hope of change has foundered. And I don't know how that is going to play, to be honest. I don't know if that will automatically lead people, you know, to strike, protest, etc., or it'll lead to a sense of demoralisation.
Well, we've had quite a lot of feedback from Americans already in the Agenda's electronic post room, where Mohamed Walji has been selecting the best Facebook responses to today's topic.
Thanks, Yvonne. Well, North American viewers took the lead in today's Facebook discussion on the state of the US economy. Our first comment came from New Yorker Battery Jackson, a regular Agenda contributor, who believes there's been a lot of scaremongering on Capitol Hill about America going bankrupt. She says, that won't happen. Obama is making empty threats. He's scaring the daylights out of old people on fixed incomes. He isn't even allowed to do that, nor is there no money. There are still operational funds. The war should end and we lose. London and Nabil Abdullah chipped in saying, I thought they stole all that oil so this wouldn't happen. I can't see them running out. It's just not possible. Bilal Asghar from California writes, it's true that most of the world's wealth is constantly flowing towards the US. However, it only goes to the few, while the government and most people are broke with debts. Kathy Huck from the northeast of England says the financial crisis in America can easily be solved. She says, stop the wars, stop bankrolling Israel and feed your own people. I'd say that was a simple enough answer to their problem. Somehow I don't think Obama will follow your advice, Kathy, but warming to the theme is Battery Jackson, who added, it would also help if corporations that make billions of dollars a year would pay some taxes. Canadian Pfizer Iqbal from Ontario reckons, America's military, economic and political prowess is finished. Why doesn't Standard & Poor or Moody's downgrade their investment status? Meanwhile, Florida-born Jonathan Bull, who is living in Istanbul in Turkey, gave this advice to his fellow Americans. Military spending is out of control, that's a given, but you should be supporting Obama holding out against the Republicans. Nothing can be passed without their consent, as they control the House of Representatives, and what they want to pass is much worse than anything the Democrats would. And that's why a compromise hasn't been reached. Well, that's all we've got time for. Back to you, Yvonne.
Thanks for that, Mohamed. Well, in the last few minutes, let's get our guests' concluding remarks, starting with you, Professor Shakespeare. You painted a very grim picture. Do you think America will default any time soon?
They can print their way out of default, but the internal situation is serious. Over 40 states are essentially bankrupt. Meredith Whitney, an excellent analyst, has forecast 100 states going bankrupt. And we know all the rest of the things.
100 states?
100 cities, I'm sorry, thank you, Robert. 100 cities going bankrupt by the end of the year. It's a very serious situation. The stresses are building, and it's because a parasitical elite and its ideas and practices have come to dominate the situation, and Main Street has been sold out. And a terrible social and political price is going to be paid for that.
Well, if I move to Robert, you heard what the professor said. How serious is this situation?
It is very serious. I wouldn't disagree with that for a moment. And we, America, must find a way to limit spending, to cut it down, and at the same time to raise more taxes from those who can afford to pay. This is
So you're saying tax the rich?
I'm not saying it in those words, but certainly everyone is aware that there could be some reform in this zone of taxation, and there probably will be. Now, this has to be led from the White House. It doesn't have to be, but if it's not led from the White House, it won't be led at all. And I think Obama's going to find that despite many press reports that he lost this round, the compromise the other day, he might find himself in very happy positions in next year's electoral campaign because he will be defending positions which American voters have great sympathy for. And I think America is getting rather war-weary, and I think the expression of America wants to start wars with 2 more Arab countries is not anywhere near the truth. It may be that there's a question being asked, why are you bombing Libya and not Syria, and so on. But America doesn't want any more wars, and I think it will try to get out of as many situations as it can.
Ask Chris for your concluding remarks, but just before, I would just want to read out the statistic: $14.2 trillion debt. That is what America owes, and that money could feed all of the 10 million people currently starving in East Africa for the next 4,000 years. Just an interesting statistic to play with there.
Well, also the American defence budget could solve the problem of world poverty. This is a time when we're having to raise collection tins for people starving to death in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa. But I think we have to talk about an agenda which is not essentially a neoliberal agenda, and what we're seeing across the world is a sort of deficit hysteria building up, which has been then used to push through further this neoliberal agenda. And I think we've got to say there are possible alternatives. You can increase taxes. You know, the wealthy across the world, not just America, have got away with 30 years of seeing taxation
Yes,
wars.
but the Republicans weren't having that at
of
all.
course. These are ideas which Obama is not going to implement, but I think you'd have to say it. You could actually cut back military expenditure. Nixon and Eisenhower, Republicans, cut military expenditure by 1/3. You know, that's not so radical. And actually defaults, well, Britain defaulted in the 1930s and its sovereign debts to the United States of America principally, and it didn't go bankrupt. You can talk about what sort of default you wanted to. That's a more radical option. You can have a people's default, where we decide not to pay the debts to the banks and their institutions. I would like to see what that default is, the deficit is made up of.
That's an interesting concept, a people's default. That just remains for me to say a very big thank you to each and every one of our guests today, and we'll see you all soon on the next agenda.